I'm here for Attitude Magazine for Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar broadcast. We have a great topic today, one of huge relevance, and I know there are thousands of you out there who have signed up for today's webinar. The topic is emotion and emotional stress, specifically the emotional sort of firestorms that come along with life with attention deficit disorder. And our guest speaker is James Ochoa. Did I pronounce that correctly? I hope.
Yes, good.
Okay, who is a licensed counselor and therapist who has worked with ADHD adults for almost 30 years. And during that practice, he has observed and written about a phenomenon that he calls emotional distress syndrome, which is comprised of anger, low self-esteem, emotional firestorms, and he's going to tell us a lot today about what this syndrome looks like as he's observed it in people with ADHD, how it can affect, like post-traumatic stress disorder, can affect your everyday life and your well-being, and give us as well strategies for weathering emotional storms, for building and maintaining healthy self-esteem and self-identity. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're super grateful to have your time. James Ochoa runs the Life Empowerment Center in Austin, Texas, where he's worked with ADHD patients, as I mentioned, for many years. He is the recent author of a book called Focused Forward, Navigating the Storms of Adult ADHD, was published in February, and a very frequent speaker at a large number of ADHD training sessions and conferences around the country, and recently an Attitude author, so we will welcome him to our fold. For more information, lots more information, visit his website, jamesochoa.com. That's jamesochoa.com. You'll see a form there where you could contact him for further information or more questions, sign up for his newsletter, and lots of great information. So everyone, in case some of you have not been on an Attitude webinar before, let me just give you the way it works. You'll see a box in your control panel on your screen. Please post your questions there. James will present a slide presentation, which you can download right now if you choose to in the handout section of your control panel. After he finishes, he will answer as many questions as our hour permits. Later today, you'll find a replay of this webinar along with the presentations on the Attitude website, attitudemag.com/webinars. Listen to it later, have your loved one's spouse. We oftentimes have people refer their spouses or wives to listen to a webinar that they've listened to because they found it so useful. And by the way, you'll also find the archives there, lots of other terrific webinars from past sessions. So with that, let me turn it over to James with our thanks, and we look forward to an interesting session.
Great. Thanks so much, Susan. I really, really appreciate y'all having me on today. I always look forward to getting information out to a larger audience, and Attitude Magazine has done such a great job at that. So I just can't say enough about the knowledge and resource that's available with y'all. It's just been so beneficial to lots of my clients, and I refer to it often. So thanks so much for having me on. You know, I would like to start today's webinar really with a short story that to me epitomizes the nature of the emotional and mental stress that surrounds the aspects of ADHD and the diagnosis of ADHD. In this story, if some of you have read my book, you may remember pieces of it that, you know, in 1989 I began working with the diagnosis in a summer day treatment program. And I worked with about a 6-year-old at that time who I was playing a 100-card sort game with. And so we have 50 pairs in this game. And this little 6-year-old was getting about 40, 45 pairs each time I played him out of 50. You know, I'm 26 at the time, and I'm wondering, I just, you know, kind of asked him, I said, hey, Josh, you know, how are you doing that? And he looked at me very simply and just said, I take pictures. And I said, what do you mean you take pictures? He said, well, I take pictures with my mind. And I was kind of stunned, certainly at 26. I was like, oh, how interesting, because here was a 6-year-old who was enormously disrupted by the diagnosis of ADHD, had a very, very bad temper, bit other children, threw chairs. And had I not been slowing down to play this game with him and just noticed that he was taking pictures of the cards and how he simply said it, I may have very well missed that this child very likely had a photographic memory, and which could be one of his greatest strengths that's easily missed. I think it's that missing component of connection with others, particularly in the diagnosis of ADHD, that is the root cause of so much of the emotional and mental stress that spins off of this condition. So today, I'm going to give you a very short space of information because in 27, almost 30 years now, as Susan was saying, I have worked with ADHD and I am still in awe of how disruptive the emotional and mental stress of the diagnosis can be for people. And I want to start today's talk by giving a little bit of a brief history of ADHD as I see it. And I think this is a good way to encapsulate kind of where we've come from. And many of you may know aspects of this, but if you look back through the 60s, it was a moral character problem. You look through the 70s, we knew that it was a behavior-related disruption. We knew that external information and strategies like checklists and things like that were very helpful for these children at the time to really kind of get back in touch with themselves or better connected to themselves. And in 1979 is where it was first called attention deficit disorder. In the 80s, we had much more of a medication decade where we understood medication was helpful. You look through the 90s, we began to understand the genetics. We began to understand the neurological process that was involved in the mind and the brain. You look through those mid-90s and we understood that the prefrontal cortex was underactive and that there were aspects of the mind that didn't keep up with details like other spaces. We understood the genetics through the 90s. I began to work with it in what's called a neurological and developmental way in the mid-90s. Because I will tell you, as a professional, I was frustrated. I had come into the field in '89. We had behavior management. We had medication. We had good ideas about what to go forward. But my clients weren't getting better to the level that I would want them to or I would expect them to. I began to study neurological development along the lines of learning in the mid-90s and began teaching that to my clients. And that educational approach is still very, very akin to a lot of the work I do today. And that began to be helpful because my clients began to understand how the diagnosis of ADHD affected them and how it's set up in their minds. As we moved into the late 90s and early 2000, really up until 2012, we have what I would consider as the neuroscience kind of aspects of a decade in which we understood there were chemical issues in the brain that were altered and different, and that we began to understand how the science of the mind worked. It was that science of the mind curiosity for me that really began to build my theoretical concepts and my strategies to work with clients. Now, granted, I'm a professional counselor in the field. I understand, if you read through aspects of my book and Focus Forward, that I was diagnosed with my own ADHD as an adult in about 1996. I'd also had a close head injury as a child at 4 years old, and I thought that's where most of my learning issues had come from. But there absolutely was a genetic issue in my family, on my mother's side of the family. But I began to understand it not only for myself, but I'm a professional in the field, and I'm beginning to look at the science of the mind and how it works, because the emotional and mental stress, as I discussed it early on, and even seeing the 6-year-old, wasn't going away. I would educate my clients. They could be well stabilized on medication. They understood strategically what they needed to do, but they kept being thrown off center. That sense of being thrown off center was the real crux of what I call the emotional distress syndrome, which is very much like a low-grade post-traumatic stress in many ways. So if we begin to look at this over 2 decades, this emotional stress and attention-related issues, I certainly understood in my own life with attention issues that it was highly disruptive. And to be very honest with you, it's still highly disruptive. I can tell you as recently as this morning, here's a very real story for the world to understand how this works. I had a dental appointment this morning. Okay, I was getting a cavity filled. Not a big thing. Oh, by the way, I'm also doing a national webinar at noon today. My wife just gently reminds me of that last night. I missed that evaluation planning detail that my mouth might not be in the best shape to do a national seminar by noon. Now, I can laugh at that, okay, and I can understand it, but it is still an emotional and mental stress that's taken me years to learn how to stay in front of. Certainly, I took care of that with my dentist this morning. I don't have anything off base with my ability to speak, and so everything is fine. But those little interruptions, as simple as that, I'm an expert in the field, and I will miss those components on a daily basis sometimes that create those bumps of mental and emotional stress. That doesn't go away. Something was really missing when I was treating ADHD, and it was very challenging to figure out because, as I talk about with a lot of my clients in many ways, and my colleagues around me, they ask me, well, how long did it take you to write your book? And I say, about 27 years. 14 years in conceptual understanding of the emotional stress and how to get around it. And about 3 years with a writing coach and an editor to really get my ideas out on paper. So I really had to stay in front of this, and I was just talking with Susan before this webinar about how the emotional and mental space we're finally beginning to really understand as professionals and how to deal with. So if we're going to deal with it, here's some ways that I would go about talking with folks about it. And much of this, again, is going to be explained in my book, Focused Forward. There's lots of good information on my website. But this is, this platform here is a great way to come back and understand the emotional stress aspects of ADHD. And the biggest one being that, as I worked with this, I began to see this as a syndrome because it was a cumulative effect of these little interruptions, as I described earlier, that add up on each other. Those aren't going to disappear, as I said, if we don't learn to manage the stress on the physical, mental, emotional end. It just really erodes our sense of self. I now know, as a professional, you absolutely can live a very full, interesting life. You really, really can. You can learn how to manage this and effectively stay in front of it. And we're going to be, and the way that I use neuroscience and science of the mind and aspects of it, this is how we begin to get around it. And it just excites me to go in. I had a passion for this in '89 when I saw the disruption with this 6-year-old. I had no idea, 27, almost, going on years and years later, that passion's grown at a level I can't describe it to you. It is so large, and it continues to feed itself because now there is really a way to get around the mental and emotional stress of the condition. So one of the first things you want to know about that aspect of getting around it and managing it is something that I would call weathering the storm. We are going to have storms that come from little emotional bumps, things we forget in life, but those storms are going to sometimes be bigger than others. That little storm for me this morning about my dental appointment, you know what? I was able to get around that. 10, 15 years ago, it might have spun me out. I might have had an argument with my wife. I could have lost 2 to 3 hours of sleep at night. Instead, I was able to take it mostly in stride, take care of business, talk to the dentist, make sure I was going to be okay, and I weathered that storm. Those storms are not going to go away. I think that is the most challenging aspect of my book and the pieces of information that I bring out to the public now. And it's hitting a resonance that's really important, is that we need to learn to navigate our lives with these storms. Because the storms themselves really do have a huge hit on our self-esteem and our self-identity. I talk a lot about this in the book. I'm not going to go over high detail today about esteem and identity, but they really do build a firm foundation. I see them as pillars that we stand on. They build all these aspects that are on the slide around self-esteem and identity: confidence, persistence, resilience, the ability to kind of stay in the pocket and really weather the storms. If these are challenged and we have this stress coming at us on an ongoing basis, we don't know how to navigate it. Much of the time when I talk about it is these pillars we're supposed to be standing on, they're just piles of rubble. It's not that we can't stand on them. It's just that they're not very stable. We really get pushed off easily. We slip, we fall. And that's always challenging if you talk about the emotional and mental stress that adds on to itself on an ongoing basis. It's that adding on and an ongoing basis that you really learn to manage and navigate your life with it. So I want to begin by absolutely going over the 8 tools today in very brief fashion that I identify that really help you to kind of stay in it, to help you weather those storms and learn to navigate it. And this was one of the challenges I really had with writing this book and in talking with my editor and writing coach, Robin, that I had to put information in this book that everyone could grab onto, because not everyone's going to be able to see me. I work in a little niche practice in South Austin, Texas, and I love my life here. And I really look forward to getting this word out to the rest of the people in the world, literally, that have this condition, to help them understand that they can get around this emotional and mental stress. So these are the 8 tools in brief form that I believe absolutely you need to really get around the attention-related issues and the stress that comes from them. First of all, you've got to accept that you have it. There is so much debate and so much dialogue. Do I have it? Do I not have it? Go get a diagnosis. Talk to your psychiatrist. Get psychological evaluation. See an expert like myself to really understand, is it there? Accept that your brain is different and unique. I have a bit of a challenge in the field right now with the uniqueness being special or something unusual or different. I think that sets us up for failure or for a position in which we're different than others. I would say our brains are very unique in how they process information, but I still have to be responsible for my life and really stay in front of it. So I have to accept, how tall or how short I am. I have to accept my ADHD and the neurology that it creates and how my system's set up. But the last thing I want you to know about acceptance is that acceptance is not just a singular event. Acceptance occurs over time because this is a developmental condition. It looks different at 20, it looks different at 6 than it does at 50 or 55 like myself. And so there's a constancy to that level of acceptance that you've got to stay in front of that's critically necessary. And so when someone asked me on a recent podcast, well, acceptance feels like you do it once. And I'm like, not with this condition, because it changes faces and it changes challenges based on what's going on in your life. So you really have to learn to accept it as an ongoing space. Mindfulness is another tool that you want to practice. Now, mindfulness and meditation has been an ongoing development and a huge uptick in research and science, and certainly here in the United States and across the world, but it's something that's been around for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Simply put, mindfulness is the ability to hit your pause button neurologically in your mind we diagnosed with ADHD do not hit that pause button often enough. It's not as automatic. And so we need to create a model of experience, meditation, mindfulness, doing things to slow ourselves down, to really stay in the pocket in our lives. I place mindfulness right now at the same level of sleep, water, food. And if you know anything on the psychological theory, I call it it's a Maslow hierarchy of need. You must create a development of mindfulness and meditation as an aspect to support the diagnosis of ADHD. And this is the simplicity of it. I'm going to take us all through about a 1 to 2 minute guided meditation. One of the most effective tools I think we can have as adults with an ADHD diagnosis is the ability, as I said, to pause and stop ourselves. Well, this doesn't have to be 20, 30, 45 minutes of sit time. It can be. But for us with attention-related issues, that's very hard for us. I will tell you very briefly before we go into the guided meditation, I separate meditation into 3 arenas. You will use guided meditations that teach you how to slow down, and someone guides you how to do that, and you begin to get the experience on what it feels like. Secondly, you want to have periods of silence separated by a bell that goes off. I use a really great app called Insight, INSIGHT Timer. Insight Timer is like a social media networked app for meditation. And it has guided ones on there as well as periods of silence you can separate by bells. And thirdly, you want to develop a contemplative form of meditation in which that would be something like yoga. Taking a walk deliberately outside, listening to a favorite song. It's the consciousness you bring to that action that gives you that ability to contemplate and to calm down and hit that pause. So now I want to guide us through about a minute or 2 of meditation. And I want all of us, wherever you are, do your best to close out distraction. And for many of us, the easiest way to do that is to just simply close our eyes. You can be in a comfortable position as possible with where you are. But close your eyes, and we're going to start literally by just taking 3 very deep breaths, and we're all going to do this on our own. And taking deep breaths times 3 is one of the most effective ways to get blood flow and oxygen to the mind to help it calm down. So I always advocate for my clients, it's not just 1 deep breath. I want everyone to take 3 deep breaths. I will do it right now, and then I will continue to guide us. Okay, that was 3 deep breaths for myself. Now that all of you have taken 3 deep breaths, I want you just simply to focus on that breath that you were taking and let it be easy. Don't force it. Don't try to change it. Just allow your breath to simply breathe in, breathe out. And as you breathe in and breathe out, focus on something that's going to happen in your immediate future, the next hour, within the next few hours. And see yourself doing that action. Just see yourself taking a simple action, whether it's, I'm going to go to lunch, I'm going to call someone at home, I'm going to have a meeting. Just see yourself simply taking that action. And allow yourself to see that action through to completion. And as you see that action through to completion, see yourself taking a deep breath. And you can literally do that now, as I will as well. That deep breath and seeing yourself complete that action is all we're going to do today on our guided meditation. That was about a minute and a half long. And in that level of guided meditation, you could now open your eyes and come back to the seminar with what we were describing and discussing on ADHD. But that simple guided meditation is something you can do very easily, and I encourage my clients to do it on an ongoing daily basis. I believe it's these short little meditations that are going to be most effective for us to reset ourselves, and developing a formal practice of mindfulness and meditation is also an incredibly important aspect. All right, so let's move on now, because beyond guided meditation, I want us to take a look at the ideas of spirituality, which I talk about in my book, as a tool. Now, spirituality is not religious necessarily. Spirituality will be a guided level of how I personally feel connected to my life. What brings personal meaning to your daily living is how I describe it. Interesting little tidbit in my book on writing about spirituality. It's a very short, it's about 2 pages long. It took me over 3 weeks to write because I wanted to be really clear that this is not something that, it's something everyone has as a personal meaning in your life. When you're talking about the stress of attention-related issues, you're talking about the need to really stay connected to yourself. Developing the ideas of spirituality are critically important. The fourth tool I want to talk about briefly is called EMDR. EMDR is a therapeutic technique that I have been trained in since 1994. It is a desensitization technique for high states of stress and anxiety. I have learned it originally to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. I talk a lot in my book about how EMDR is enormously helpful around the stress of ADHD, in the chronic nature of it, but also in learning to really develop an internal sense of yourself of strength. It is a therapeutic technique, and there is certification, and it is a technique that's got to be done within session, so it's not something you can do on your own necessarily. And so it is something that, if you look at my book, there are lots of therapists who understand EMDR. I talk a little bit in my book about how to use it. I want you to understand that there are really good techniques around helping the mental and emotional stress of attention issues. The fifth one I want to talk about briefly is called imagination. How is imagination a tool? I think it's one of the most powerful tools we've ever been given, because imagination is an ability to envision and see things. In my book, I talk a lot about the use of imagination to develop a connection with yourself. Those of us, including myself with ADHD, I don't have any problem with imagining things. I daydream a lot. Now I know how to channel that daydreaming into an imagination aspect of life, but it's a science aspect of the mind that's enormously powerful that I talk a lot about on how to use. And so with imagination, you can really stay connected to yourself and find ways to strengthen your sense of who you are and how to move forward with the stress of the diagnosis of ADHD. The sixth tool I'll talk about is intuition. You want to be able to develop intuition within a space that says, what is my highest good, or what's the best decision I can make in any given situation for me? Most of us talk about intuition as a sixth sense. We talk about intuition as an issue in which, if I look at the stress of ADHD, it's just been run over. I can't feel it. I don't know what it is. I completely rely on other people. I don't know what's best for me. I believe you can develop your intuition. I believe we all have it. And I believe it is a God-given space of our own birth and development that we reorient and reconnect to. A very simple tool on the next slide called the Intuition Walk is a great way to develop your intuition. You just simply free up some time. You go to take a walk. You come to a corner. You decide, do I want to go right? Do I want to go left? And you follow that first impulse. An intuitive impulse is generally, it's always going to be no more than about a second to a second and a half long. It is your first snap reaction. It's that first kind of pop as I snap my finger. That's what you're looking for. Well, when you simply take a walk, it has really no goal other than to go practice my intuition. You see where it takes you. But I want you to engage with that sense of decision making with yourself in a way that's meaningful, but doesn't have huge disruption to it. So it can be for 3 minutes. It can be for 3 hours. It's the process of getting reconnected to your intuition that I think is enormously meaningful. The seventh tool I talk about in my book is enormously important, called humor. Humor doesn't need a lot of explanation, okay? It's the idea of laughter. It's an enormous stress relief. And I absolutely had to sneak a picture of my dear father, who is no longer with us and lived to 88 years old. And that is just a wonderful picture of he and I at one of my son's bar mitzvahs with very, very fun hats on. And that we just had a blast. And my dad was called Mr. Sunshine by lots of folks, but he really brought humor and laughter into my life and other people's lives. But laughter and humor is critical. Many of us, myself included, humor was used as a tool of making fun of harm. So I've had to really rehabilitate my ability to laugh at myself, which is not so great still, I would say. Over time it's getting better. But I love the idea of laughter and humor as a release element, and it's wonderful regarding the kind of softening of the tough edges or the mental stress that can surround issues with ADHD. The last tool I want to talk about today, I love the title of this that kind of just came naturally as I was working with these ideas over years, is Strategic Therapeutic Daydreaming. Strategic Therapeutic Daydreaming is the ability to envision and see things in your mind's eye or feel them or hear them for the reason of your mental and emotional health. I describe the ideas of developing worlds literally in your imagination that you can daydream for confidence and courage and the ability to take care of yourself. And I describe a lot of that in the book that I go through, but I don't have time to go through in detail today. But I use strategic therapeutic daydreaming on an ongoing basis to feel good, to feel wind on my face and imagine that happening in my mind. And I've done this over time that creates a neurological strength for me to stay connected and to calm myself more effectively. I believe, as I said, with meditation or with daydreaming or any of use of our imagination, that the practicing of this becomes so critically necessary for the diagnosis of ADHD because of the mental and emotional stress that spins off of this on an ongoing basis. So those are the 8 tools that I present in more detail in my book, Focused Forward. But I really want to introduce you to that really do make a difference on the ADHD spectrum to really feel better about who you are. My last couple of slides in these last couple of minutes that I'll talk before we go to some questions and answers with Susan is that what you're seeing here in this picture on this next slide is this is a clay mold of a brain that I have as a white noise tool. It's a fun game that I have in my office that I play with and I make designs with. But the statement on it that a mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions. what I want you to understand about that statement is that's true on both sides of the coin regarding distress or positive stress, eustress, that we really choose in our life. So when we stretch our imaginations and we stretch our experiences in learning new information about what ADHD is and is not, they're not going to go back to being the same. Which is why, as I talked about way back in the mid-90s, I found it so critically helpful to educate people about how their brains and their minds developed along the lines of learning and what the diagnosis was. It really helps to really understand how to stay grounded. And the last thing I'll say that in my last slide around this just gorgeous storm picture that the designer of my book for the interior and the picture, Kim, who's just a great individual, came up with this picture. I just love it. But it's the idea of storms, right? Storms in our lives that really come on an ongoing basis that won't go away. So the mental and emotional stress is going to spin off of this diagnosis on an ongoing basis. I'll be the first one to tell you, and you've probably heard it and felt it before, we know it. We know it doesn't go away. Learning to manage it is the most critical aspect. Learning to navigate our lives with it is a critical aspect so that we can really live our lives in a more effective, demonstrated way that's much more powerful. I can't say enough about the emotional and mental stress, Susan. That's a very brief overview that I've even got about 6 or 7 minutes over longer than I thought I would talk.
Really helpful. One thing that I would love to hear is another example of how emotional stress affects people. I thought your description of the dentist appointment and the stress that not managing that was a great one, and I wondered if there's another common scenario that you could suggest that people would identify with that suggests the kind of daily stress that people live with ADHD.
Sure. One of the other big stressors is, let's take time management or organization. Mm-hmm. We know that time management is a critical factor of, it gets skewed through the neurological processing elements of the mind with the diagnosis of ADHD. So I misperceive how long something's going to take me or not, or I don't foresee transition that's needed or things that need to happen. And so if I take time, the stress that spins off of time, the mental and emotional stress of being late, of thought I could be there, oh, I missed this transition, is one element of another idea of it. But then you could take organization as well, Susan. I mean, the mental and emotional stress of wanting to clean out my desk or needing to reset it, or I have a shelf at home that, I put everything as kind of a platform to make sure I don't lose things. But that shelf gets overrun, as my wife will tell you, about every 3 to 6 months. And it's probably about 3 months overdue right now. But the stress that comes off of that is a huge part of mental and emotional stress of the diagnosis. That's a direct result of it.
Right. One that occurs to me that I've heard from readers and I've experienced myself is the sense of never being caught up, always being behind, so you never really relax because there's always more that's not done. That sort of constant stress, that you live with on a daily basis.
I think that's a really important one because it creates what I would call as a hypervigilance that doesn't go away, right? We don't settle down. Mm-hmm. And so this is where meditation, this is where learning to pause is very helpful to kind of take the hard edges off of that bubble sometimes. But many of us will say, well, I want it to go away. And I'm like, well, it doesn't go away. We learn to channel it. And effectively, within things we're passionate or interested about, it creates an enormous amount of energy for us a lot of times if we can use it effectively. But it doesn't turn off, so we have to learn to pause and rest and relax from it.
Which is really hard to do when you're feeling like you're behind,
Yes,
you're behind.
You're
not allowed to. You're not allowed to stop. I thought your comments about acceptance were really interesting, and the fact that it's something that changes over time. Could you talk some more about the stages of ADHD in lifetimes, and we have a couple of specific questions from parents about how to help their kids accept this, which I thought is also very interesting. Accept that they have ADHD. How do you
Sure.
talk to an 8-10-year-old about it?
Right. Well, the ideas of acceptance being an ongoing process, because developmentally, yes, it looks different at different ages. I'll fold in what parents are looking for as far as how to talk to children or how to talk to adolescents about it, is that, remember, we're talking about a genetic condition. So there are going to be characteristics that come in through the family, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents. It doesn't mean that those people haven't been successful, but they may have had stress from it. So the first thing to talk about with children that is like, or growing up, is that it's like hair color, height, and weight. Okay, it's passed on. Everyone's given a certain way to see the world. Everyone's given a certain way to work in the world. These are the things that work well for you. These are the things that are more challenged. Let's come up with strategies on how to manage it. But this is where I was talking about in the mid-90s, Susan, that how the neurology develops along the lines of learning. I've taken kids through programs in elementary schools about how memory, attention, sequencing, all those things develop. So you teach children how their minds learn, but you ask them about how things work for them so that they can begin to develop their own personal strategies with it. So to me, it becomes a deficit or a disorder when we don't talk about it, or it's not managed or effectively dealt with. But you're honest about it in that everyone has differences. Those differences can become more problematic if you don't know what they are, don't know how to manage them. That's really how I talk about it, or tell parents to talk about it. And the ideas of acceptance is that, I've had adults in their 60s who will come in for an original diagnosis because they wondered about it. One woman came in as a result of her granddaughter at 19 being diagnosed, who said, "Hey, Grandma, guess what? I think I know what's going on here." And this woman had been very successful in her career, but had retired. And because she had retired, she had lost the structure to her life, of her career. And suddenly she got into some very difficult spin cycles of emotional and mental stress because she couldn't plan and prioritize her days effectively as when she was in her career. So she had a whole new developmental issue of how to organize and executively manage her life now that she's retired, and she thought things were going to be kind of peaceful and relaxed. But so acceptance for her was that, okay, this looks like it does now, and I have to learn to manage it. Does that make sense, Susan? Did I lose you? Okay. And I'm hoping that folks can continue to hear me. Susan, I've lost my audio on you.
Sorry,
and so I will keep going.
Back. I
That's
don't know how I got unmuted. My apologies.
That's okay. We were going to have an interruption here somewhere along.
Right. Some questions again about kids. I guess you believe, obviously, that children can have this kind of emotional stress.
Absolutely, because it's and how do you manage it? So with children, that emotional and mental stress, you can teach children to calm themselves down, take a pause, take a 1-minute meditation, breathing break very early on. Because, but I've also seen in families where the diagnosis of ADHD was understood, and what I'm calling the emotional distress syndrome is not ever really developed as a serious developmental problem, because the child is given strategies, is listened to, is taught about what the diagnosis is or is not, or is supported with academic help or tutors or ways of trying to fill their interest and their passions. So to me, the emotional distress syndrome doesn't necessarily have to develop as a syndrome necessarily. It's a stress we will all go through, But I have many clients who, as children, were raised with a very healthy understanding,
Right.
and they did not, they never really developed it as a problem, but they still have to learn to manage the emotional mental stress that spins off of it.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
A couple of people were wondering about the difference between intuition and emotional and daydreaming, or sort of,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. How do you? What, um,
What's the difference? Well, I have and the other topic that gets pulled into here, and I really appreciate that question, is intuition and impulsivity. Okay,
right. Right.
because
Right. Right.
right, so that impulsive drive of I want to go do it right now, it's really shiny. That impulse drive is a huge component of challenges within the diagnosis of ADHD, and the differences as I describe them in the book are simply impulsivity has an enormous drive to it that's got a lot of energy behind it that's kind of pushing you forward. And it's like, I can't wait, I got to do it now. Intuition is going to be more related to a quieter voice. This is my sense. This feels like the best thing for me to do, although it might be risky to say this, or it might be, I've got to put some effort forth to follow through with this. I feel like this is the best thing for me to do. So generally I will tell people, if they feel like it's an impulse drive, but they got to do it now, is to take a minute break. Take a 3-minute break, sit with it, and say, okay, does this feel like this high energy drive of an impulse, or does it feel like a pull in intuition? I describe in the book, it's like, to me, a young child, or like my son when they were younger, it's just like someone picking up my hand gently and leading me somewhere, okay? And so that's the best way to describe it. And the differences between intuition and daydreaming, well, daydreaming has more to do with envisioning things I'd like to be able to do, or being able to calm myself down through the use of my imagination. And intuition can be referenced while you're daydreaming or thinking about those things. But intuition is really how I want to guide my life in a way that's most effective for me.
Okay. Yeah. So quite different, really.
Yeah.
Than daydreaming, right?
Yes.
Coming back to the EMDR, can you describe a little bit more about how that works? And
Sure.
other questions too. Is it? Do you recommend it for children? How does one find a practitioner? Just a little bit more on that. On the EMDR. Yep.
If you go to, could be 30,000 plus, I know it's at least that many worldwide therapists that are trained in EMDR. And if you go to the EMDR Institute's website, if you just Google the term EMDR Institute, you will pick up their website, and there will be certified practitioners on that website that will lead you toward the areas that you're in the world. But EMDR is a fascinating tool in that, very simply, it is a bilateral hemisphere crossing of the mind back and forth, like a metronome might be, that happens when you're sleeping at night. So when you're dreaming at night, you're having this crossing of hemispheres back and forth. Well, you take that technique and you bring it into a therapeutic session to focus on stress or anxiety. It has a way of desensitizing that stress or anxiety while you're using the technique more effectively than just narrative or talk therapy. It's a lot more detail than even I'm giving there, but it is a very effective technique for stress, and I use it, probably in 90% of my sessions on an ongoing basis, because it's an engagement. It's a way to connect to the neurological processing aspects of the mind in a way that's got a little more effectiveness or a little more depth. And I like to also call it a conscious state of hypnosis. It's like you go into a processing system of the mind that we don't necessarily engage in on a daily basis. And when we're dreaming at night, we have this same kind of process. And so we're mimicking that process within the session, but it's very, very helpful for desensitizing the stress of attention issues. So like say you had trouble organizing something, or you had some trouble following through, you felt really guilty or really bad about it, the use of EMDR could lessen that sense or that feeling state of being bad or being the guilt you feel about it, so that you don't feel as bothered by it, so that you have more ability to be effective going forward the next time you had issues with organizing. It's a very brief example, but I've used EMDR. It is a therapeutic technique, and so it's one that I definitely needed to put it in the book, but it's something you have to do in session with a practitioner.
Okay. And can you talk, what do you think about neurofeedback then? I mean, is that something that you use in your practice, or you have seen success with in your patients?
Sure. And neurofeedback, I have seen many of my clients use. I do not use it in my practice. And neurofeedback is going to effectively help you connect to feeling the state of being able to calm down and stay focused within a realm of, say, thinking or alpha waves in the brain for calming down. It's a way to, I talk about it as a way for people with ADHD to really experience the ability to calm down and develop neurologically areas of strength effectively. And it's a very effective tool, and I've referred to it before. I believe it is a skill set that's going to have to be practiced to some degree throughout one's life because of the neurological strength you're looking for within neurofeedback realms that can be very beneficial, but we have to keep those going throughout life to keep them strong.
Okay. And brain training programs as well?
Well, brain training programs are a fun exercise that are very engaging and interesting. All the hard, double-blinded, repeated research would indicate that it's very helpful in the moment for helping you feel more focused and concentrated or better memory aspects. There's somewhat of a challenge in transferring those skills outside of that game or outside of that position. I have used Lumosity for years. I like it as a training tool of exercise to focus and concentrate. But again, my position is that it's going to be an ongoing space of needing to maintain your progress over periods of time, much like you would with exercise.
Sure. Yeah, it's not something you just do it, you train your brain, and that's over, it's done, you're done.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Makes sense. Interesting question here from Jason about electronic media.
Mm-hmm.
It can be, as he says, it can be a help or it can be a hindrance to people with ADHD. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know many of our parents, webinar parents, are just beside themselves in terms of managing their children's screen time. And I think adults can have issues with that as well, right? I mean,
absolutely. So media and technology and screens and those kind of things were built to attract attention, to grab your attention and hold it, okay? And they do very, very good at that. I talk about that, if you look at the diagnostic measures globally, you're looking at about a 3 to 5% diagnostic pool, okay, in a general sense. It might be a little higher for children, a little less for adults, but that's a general sense of the number of people in the world who have this neurological patterning or a diagnosis. Media would tell you, or that it could be as high as 10 or 15% of the world. Mm-hmm. I believe it's technology, the rate with information coming at us now, and the stress that we're under that's creating an enormous attention-related problem for a lot more people. So screen time creates attention issues very much because it's a reward base. It's going to grab your attention. I encourage people to take screen vacations, evaluate. Which is what we did with our boys growing up. We would talk about screen time. How much screen time, on, off, how do you balance it? How is it effective? Because if you don't take breaks from it, then yes, neurologically it's just like a magnet and it'll keep you attached. So I'm much more of a proponent of communicating with kids around the amount of electronics they're using, looking at balance points of taking pauses and getting away from them to some degree, and certainly turning them off within at least an hour before sleep, if not 2 hours, because you just are maxing out the chemistry of the mind if you stay connected to them late at night. And it does cause sleep issues if you just activate the mind too much that late at night.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Some questions around medication. So some people have observed that when their child's medication wears off, they become more emotional, and they're wondering about the connection between emotionality and medication. Is it affected by medication? Is it an independent variable? In other words, someone else says, so if my teen is taking the correct medication, would they still be overly emotional? Again, I guess, is this an independent variable, or is it connected to medication?
Sure. Well, when you look at medication for the diagnosis of ADHD, you're talking about the ability to more effectively focus and concentrate, stay motivated on what you need to get done. I like to talk about it as it's like an eyeglasses for the mind. It helps you kind of focus on the things you need to and to plan and prioritize things more effectively. So effective medication in helping you plan and prioritize and be more connected to your life can actually decrease the emotional disruption you feel because you're more centered. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about medication rebound is what it's generally called, where there's an irritability coming off the medication. Many times I will tell if that irritability is too high, then yeah, it's always something you need to talk to your doctor about because it can be an intolerable side effect. And I'm not a medical doctor. I have a lot of information about medication, but I don't prescribe medication. I don't tell clients what to do with it. But I will say this irritability factor in there is a common issue. A lot of times I will, if a child or a parent notices it's happening, is give the child, a 30-minute kind of break from things without any stress necessarily to be able to calm down to some degree. Sometimes doing a little bit of exercise can kind of help the blood flow and oxygen. Sometimes, drinking a cold glass of water or doing something to kind of smooth out that irritability. And then some people have used smaller amounts of potentially like caffeine or green teas in the afternoon to kind of smooth out that effect. But typically, if it's too demonstrated, there's too much irritability, which absolutely can cause more emotional kind of related challenges, then it is something to talk to their doctor about to potentially look for some other options.
Right, okay. We are unfortunately out of time, and I want to close with a quote from one of the listeners, Tiffany. She says, I'd like to say a big thank you to James for your book, Focus Forward, especially the audio version. Several people have mentioned that, by the way, so listeners, look for James on audio. She says, I found this hugely helpful, and having addressed much of the emotional side of my difficulties, thanks to your book, I'm now thriving completely medication-free. So a big thanks to you for this, your very significant contribution. And so thanks, everyone, for listening, and thank you so much, James, for all the work you do. It's very interesting and outside the norm.
I really appreciate that, Susan. And by the way, I'm telling folks, for the holidays coming up, buying a book like mine and giving it to your family is like giving the gift of knowledge and understanding of yourself. It's just helping others understand you is one of the most effective things you can do. So thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks, everybody. Check out, look for James's book on Amazon, right?
Focus Forward on Amazon, through my website. It's also on Audible, and it's on Kindle.
Great. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
All right. Thanks, Susan.